Hey, everybody.
Hey.
Hi.
So if I could get everybody to turn on your camera. If somebody doesn't have a working camera, maybe email me and let me know that, but I'd like everybody to have their cameras on during class so it actually feels like a real experience for me.
Yeah, it's solely for you, Fran.
Yep. Okay, so a couple things before we get started. Last week, somebody asked me about the tool called Grammarly and for writing your reports, and I had never used it before. So I looked into it, and yeah, I think you can use it if you think it will help you, that's fine. It's not gonna write the report for you. So it's not gonna solve all of your problems in that regard. And also I read some stuff about it being a little glitchy and making mistakes. So it's, you know, it's not a person, it's a machine. So it's, you know, like any machine, it's liable to make mistakes. So it might choose the word wrong, tell you to put in the wrong word, for instance. So it's not foolproof. But if anyone feels comfortable using that, sure, give it a try. I don't have any problem with that. So then you're going to turn in the reading report. It's due on February 19th. So after that, they'll be due pretty much every week. But the first report isn't due until the 19th. And it's, we don't have class next Friday. So and you're going to turn it in on Blackboard. So it's super easy to do that, but let me just show you that in case anybody has any questions about it. So if you go to Blackboard, this is the home page for the class. And I don't really fool with the home page very often. Sometimes I'll put an announcement up, but the main thing for the class is content, which is over here. If you can see my cursor on the left side toolbar, it says content. If you click on content, the first thing that comes up is the first reading report. I also put a copy of the syllabus there, and then I'm going to put all the lectures that are recorded up on Blackboard as well. And then down below, any readings. So content is where you can find the most important things. So I'll put today's lecture up there as well. So if you click on reading report 1, you click on view complete. And then you click on this, and then you should be able to find your name here. If you're not there, let me know, but everybody should be there. It also has a field for entering your name. I'm not sure why. And then you can give it a title, which should just be reading report number 1. And then you just choose the file from wherever it is and then hit upload down here. So pretty simple. Does anybody have any questions about that?
So on the paper, like we don't write the name, then professor name. Okay.
Sorry, I couldn't really hear you. The transmission was kind of garbled.
Okay, so on the paper, like when we write the paper, when we download, like in the top, like I used to write, and everybody else, I think, like my name, date, the class name, professor's name.
Oh, I'm not sure if you have to do that. But to be safe, maybe put your name at any opportunity it gives you to put in your name, I would put it in just to make sure.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Wyatt, what are you doing there, buddy? Are you brushing your teeth? Okay, can you maybe do that later? I brushed my teeth before class. Okay, I've lost Wyatt. Okay, so that makes sense to everybody? Anybody have any questions about Turnitin? And then it's really cool because then I can, I can access them, read them there and grade them. And it also has a plagiarism check, which is great for you. So it's due on the 19th. If you can turn it in early, that's great, because then I can just start grading it. And I'll start grading them as soon as they come in. So if you turn it in sooner than later, it'll probably be graded more quickly. Okay, so I'm going to do the first part of the lecture today, and then the second part is recorded. And as soon as I finish the first part, I'll post the second part so you can watch it right away, or you can watch it later. And so I'm going to put the lectures on Dropbox, also on Blackboard, and also on YouTube. So you have 3 places you can find those. And I'll send you the links for all of those. And then after the lecture, we should finish by 1 o'clock, and then we'll have a break. And those of you in group 1 will come back at 1 o'clock and meet with me. And then after that, group 2 at 2 o'clock. If you're not in group 1 or group 2, you're not meeting with me today. So then class will be over at 1 o'clock.
I have a question.
Yep.
For group 1, I don't know how this works since it's the first day. Do we stay while group 2 is with you, or after we're done, class is over for us?
Say that again.
You know how group 1 is gonna meet first, and then you're gonna meet with group 2 after. Do we stay through the group 2 meeting?
Oh, no. No, the whole point is that I can talk to you in groups of 10 or so,
Okay,
So-
great.
Yeah, the smallness of it is the key. So I'm going to end this meeting at 1 o'clock, and then you'll use the same link to, if you're in group 1, I'll start a new meeting at 1:30 with group 1, and then we'll end the meeting, and then I'll start a new meeting with group 2
Okay,
at
great.
2 o'clock.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Professor, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How do I know what group I'm in?
I sent that information yesterday. So can you check your email? It was an attachment.
Okay.
But I know that it's alphabetical. So your last name is with a K, so you're not meeting with me today.
Okay, sounds good.
But if you look through your email, if you still don't have it, I can send it back to you. Let's see. So last week we were talking about New Amsterdam and the Lenape culture. Before we do that though, this was last weekend, I found one of these in Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn. Who can tell me what this is?
Is it an erratic?
It is an erratic. Who was that? Abram?
Yeah.
That's great. Good work. Yes, it's a big piece of schist that was brought down. Actually, it might be granite. The interesting things about erratics is that since they were carried sometimes hundreds of miles by a glacier, they're not always necessarily the same type of rock that we have around here. So I think this is a piece of granite. So yeah, it's an erratic. Good work. So let's talk a little bit about New Amsterdam. So we talked about a series of director generals that they had. We talked about Peter Minuit, he was the guy who bought the island from the Lenape, and then William Keft, who started a war with the Lenape, and then there were a lot of other ones too, many of them really hapless. So the Dutch West India Company finally sent this guy over in 1647, and he was a really tough character named Peter Stuyvesant. I'm sure you've all heard the name. And he had one leg. He had a wooden leg, and so they behind his back called him Peg Leg Pete. Probably not to his face. And he was sent over to kind of sort out the colony. And one of the first things he did was he tried to repair the fort, which was had never really been finished. They were always worried about invasion, so they wanted him to fortify the colony. They were worried about the British invading, with good reason. So he builds a defensive wall around the settlement. And we have records of who built the wall. And it was a English guy named Tom Baxter who built the wall. And there were a series of stone bastions, like lookout towers. And then the part in between was made out of oak boards. And you can see it on this map, which is from your reading, which is the Castello plan. So this is the next important map that you're going to be studying. Why would it have an Italian name? That makes no sense at all. Well, it's because it was discovered in a castle in Italy, the Castello, in 1900. So that's why it's nicknamed the Castello plan. But it was drawn by a cartographer named Cortelyou in 1660, and the one that we have is a copy from 5 years later. And so here's the Castello plan, and here you can clearly see Stuyvesant's wall. So it goes around, pretty much around the whole colony. Hope you can see that laser pointer okay. Can everybody see that? So here's the fort down here. So the wall looks like from this map, it starts here. And it goes up the Hudson River side and then across what was then the boundary, northern boundary of the colony, all the way over to the East River and then down the East River edge. And these are the bastions, you can see those. So those were built out of stone. That would have been almost like a little building that people could get up into and have a lookout station there. And then the parts in between were made out of boards. And then you can see that they cleared land on either side of the wall, which is what they typically did when they were building a defensive wall in that era. And the ground would have been sloped up to it here. So, and then all of this here is just like open field so that they can see the enemy if they're approaching. North of the map, what you're not seeing here is all the farmland that stretched pretty much on the whole island of Manhattan, which you can see in the Manatus map that you saw in the last reading. So the wall, Stuyvesant did succeed in building the wall. The problem was at this point, New Amsterdam was not doing too well economically. And so people started, even before it was finished, people started stealing the boards from the wall. Why? Because they wanted to burn them to stay warm. So that shows you how kind of the colonists were struggling at this point. And they probably didn't take the threat of invasion very seriously. So from the very beginning, there were holes in the wall that you could just walk through. So as a defensive strategy, it was pretty worthless. There were two gates in the wall. So you see, here's the fort here, and there's this big wide street that goes through a gate and then north into the farmland. And so this gate was called the land gate. That makes sense. And then the other gate was down here, which was called the water gate because it was right next to the river. And then here you can see the Castello map overlaid on a current map of the city. So what do you notice here? I mean, the Castello map is tiny compared to the city today. So why is that? Anybody have any idea why that would be?
Well, present day Battery Park was built from the soil that was excavated for the previous Twin Towers.
Yeah, totally.
So all the surrounding areas was literally built after the fact.
Yeah, so this is Battery Park over here that Eduardo is talking about. And that was built with fill from excavations. So the island has been artificially extended into the Hudson River. And then you can see here, it was extended also to the south. This is Battery Park right here. That happened gradually over the last couple 100 years. And then likewise, on the East River edge has also been extended. So this street that's in the Costello plan that's running right along the edge of the river is now 3 or 4 blocks inland. That's Pearl Street. And then they built Water Street and Front Street. And then this is the FDR out here. So Battery Park City was kind of more recent fill, but this idea that the island needed more width this has been happening for centuries. So they've been gradually filling it in. And what did they use? Like Eduardo said, when they would excavate for a building, they would use that like a cut and fill thing to extend the island. But they would just use whatever they had. Sometimes could have been garbage, could have been old building supplies, gravel, rocks, dead cats. I mean, whatever. And the idea was that they needed to extend the island because land was scarce and it was valuable. So it's interesting to see how the Costello plan is so tiny compared to the island today. So the other map that is in your reading is a redrawing of the Costello plan by a really interesting architect named I.N.P. Stokes. And this was in 1916 that he commissioned a redrawing of the plan. And it's part of this crazy project that he undertook, which is a 6-volume history of New York called The Iconography of Manhattan Island. Each volume is about 700 pages long and includes everything you can think of: maps, images, old documents, history of the city, surveying records, an elaborate index of practically every building in the city going back hundreds of years. It was the work of a lifetime basically, and he was obsessed with it. I have a set of these books. This is 1 volume. They're gigantic and just incredible, incredibly detailed. Just the font is really tiny, so sometimes I have to use a magnifying glass to read it. But it has land records, farm boundaries. It has a chronology. Get this, a chronology of the entire city's history, going back 400 years, day by day. So if you want to know what happened on October 17th, 1842, you can grab the Stokes volume and find out. So he went through newspapers, it's incredible, insane. So he redrew, of course he would, right? Redrew the Costello plan. Really obsessive architects. I mean, architects tend to be obsessive, I guess. So what did he do here? I mean, how is this different from the original here? He tried to just like copy it as best he could, but it's a little bit more like an illustration than the original one was. But both the original and the Stokes copy have every single building. And there was also a list of the names of everybody who owned these buildings. So it's not just a map, it's a record of who lived there. It includes the fort, it includes the wall, it includes the canals that ran up Beaver Street and Broad Street, and the little bridges going over the canals. And you can see that, these were the Dutch, right? So the Dutch were experts at building canals, and they were trying to turn New Amsterdam into Amsterdam. at this point. They were modeling the new settlement after where they came from. And of course, Amsterdam has this great district in the inner city called the Grachtengordel with all the canals. And then there are other things that I don't quite understand, and I wonder if Stokes didn't start adding things. There's this path here that does not, to my eye anyway, show up on the original map. So there are things that I suspect he embellished and added.
I have a question.
Yes.
So at this point, is like Upper Manhattan kind of still unsettled, or are they starting to, work on those areas and develop them?
So if you go back to the Manatus map, the first map we looked at,
Mhm.
you can see that there are farms and there are farmhouses
I see.
on the rest
Okay.
of the island. So at this point, in the 1660s, it would have been the same situation.
Okay.
So farmland, definitely not a wilderness at this point,
Mhm.
not a lot of trees left, rural, and then there were highways that crisscrossed the island, and there were the beginning of villages. So at this point, Harlem was becoming its own village,
I see.
some 10 miles to the north.
Okay.
And then over the next couple of centuries, more villages emerged too, which we'll talk about when we look at the commissioner's plan.
Mhm.
So yeah, to answer your question, it was farmland, but there were beginning to be these outlying villages that were becoming, they weren't urban, but they were little towns, with a church and a
Mhm.
grocery store and stuff like that.
Okay.
Could I follow up to that question?
Yep.
So, so I know that the Lenape also had their own farms, and then at one point the Dutch started also having their farms too. So at this point, were the Lenape like completely removed from Upper Manhattan, or were they like were the Dutch still taking over?
At this point, all the farms were Dutch farms, but the Lenape were still around. They had just been, after the war that the Dutch fought with them, they kind of, you can imagine they were a little hesitant to live on the island, although they were still there. They were still coming in and out of the island, So I think at this point they were living in Long Island and New Jersey and not so much on the island itself, but they were still around. So here's some things, some key points of the Costello plan that I would like you to learn. So first of all, here's the wall. And the wall, like I said, was never really worked the way it was supposed to. And there were two gates, the land gate and the water gate over here. And then the street that was running from the fort north through the land gate up into the farmland to the north of the city was, of course, Broadway. And all of these streets that you see here are still there today, and they still are the same shape and width, and pretty much the same width and everything. So if you go walking down Broadway today, and you get down here, you'll see by the Battery, you'll see that the street does still curve like this, in exactly the same configuration. And it got wider here because you can see the fort is in the way. So the street widens to get around this corner of the fort. And that curve is still there today. So in creating that widened space at the foot of Broadway, this was just kind of a leftover area, and that became the cattle market. So that was where they bought and sold livestock. And it was kind of the only, it wasn't certainly a park, but it was an open space. So in addition to a marketplace, it was a place where people could gather because it was a big outdoor space. So this will come into play a little bit later. We'll see what that turns into. And then some of the other streets are Beaver Street, which is this little street running off Broadway that had a canal in it. And then Broad Street, rather, running parallel to Broadway that also had a canal. And why did they build the canals? Well, they're trying to get shipping into the city. It's just easier to unload the ships that way. And then here's Pearl Street along the river. And I mentioned that because now it's several blocks inland. There's all the fill that's happened. This little street here is William Street. And this is the fort down here. And then the street that ran along the inside of the wall, you can see here, gradually became, of all things, Wall Street. So that's Wall Street. So the fort, the wall gradually decayed, and by the 1690s, most of it had been just kind of taken down, and wasn't really, parts of it were still there, but it wasn't really happening anymore. So the Dutch West India Company, because of mismanagement, including this ill-advised war against the Lenape, ended up going bankrupt, which left the populace of New Amsterdam kind of high and dry. And it had been a pretty thriving commercial port, but people started leaving, and by 1661, the population was only down to 1,500 people. So it was on its last legs, despite Stuyvesant's efforts to rescue it. And then the invasion that the Dutch had long feared finally happened in 1664, when, just as they expected, the British invaded because they wanted to take over this position, this settlement, which was at a perfect strategic Jumana, maybe you could mute yourself there. They wanted to take over because it was on the Hudson River, and it was it had a great harbor, a very deep protected harbor for shipping. So the English had long had their eyes on it, and so they decided to invade during a moment of weakness with the Dutch. And this is a quote from the Reverend Samuel Drisius, who was one of the pastors in the Dutch church, and his house overlooked the Hudson River, and so he was watching all of this happen. And so he wrote a letter about it, about the invasion. And he said the frigates, and there were 4 of them. Anybody know what a frigate is?
A warship?
Yeah, it's a warship. They still have frigates today. It's different from a destroyer, but I'm not sure how, but they're slightly different. I think, anyway, I don't know the difference, but it's similar. Frigate is a warship, and you can see down here that this is a frigate, and they had these these ports that they could open and fire cannons sideways. So that's when they fired sideways, that was called a broadside. So he says the frigates came under full sail on the 4th of September with guns trained on one side. So they sailed up to the fort, to Fort Amsterdam. They opened the gun ports. The cannons came out on one side. And they said they had orders and intended, if any resistance was shown to them, to give a full broadside to this open place, and then take it by assault and make it a scene of pillage and bloodshed. So just to translate that and put it into plain English, they sailed up, they opened the gun ports, they stuck the cannon out, and they shouted to Stuyvesant, or whoever was in charge at the fort at that point, if you don't surrender immediately, we're gonna fire the cannons, and on this open place, which tells you that the wall was a joke and the fort was a joke, and it wasn't defended. There was no way that the Dutch were gonna defend the settlement. And if you don't surrender, we're gonna invade and we're gonna kill everybody. So the Dutch surrendered. And then the British landed and they walked right down Broadway to Fort Amsterdam. And that was it. New Amsterdam ceased to exist, and New Amsterdam becomes New York for the first time, 1664. So that's an important date for you to remember. And it was named, this is not as important, but just so you know, it was named after the Duke of York, James. He was the brother of the king, and he apparently never visited. So the person who New York is named after never actually saw this magnificent place. What happened to the Dutch? Anybody want to guess what happened to them? So they weren't killed because they did surrender. So did they sail away? What happened to them?
They probably used them to do forced labor, perhaps, or prisoners.
No, luckily for them,
They
No.
went north.
Hmm?
They went north.
no, they didn't go anywhere.
Oh, they stayed.
They stayed because the English were smart enough to realize that they had been there a while, and they had established trading routes and trading relationships. And it was to the English advantage to just kind of let them continue. They had everything except the government. So they changed the Dutch street names to English street names, but all the Dutch, they didn't kill anybody. They didn't throw them in prison. They didn't become refugees. They just continued. And so New York had, after that, for generations, for centuries, had a pronounced Dutch presence. And some of the main families in the history of the city were of Dutch origin. The Roosevelts, for instance, were Dutch origin. The Remsons, you see their names in a lot of street names to this day. Van Voorhees, all these, and the Stuyvesants, then his descendants became an important family and business in the city. And you still see Dutch names. If you open up a phone book of New York, there's still remnants of these old Dutch families that are still here. A few of them anyway. So I'm telling you this just because in the history of the city, it's not really that important, but it's kind of a quirky detail, which is that wasn't the last we heard of the Dutch Navy. The Dutch came back in 1673 and they conquered the British. And so it became not New Amsterdam again, it became New Orange. So New York was then renamed New Orange. And then the next year, the British came back, kicked out the Dutch again, and New Orange became New York again. So that's a kind of obscure fact, but you could ask your friends, did you know that New York was once called New Orange? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some buildings from this era. So this is a really important one. This is Trinity Church. And it was started in 1696. So 30 years later, after the British invade, they finally build, the Dutch had the Reformed Church, Reformed Dutch Church. But this was the Church of England, the Anglicans, you know? And so this was the first church the first permanent freestanding building that they established for their religion. And they chose an intersection that ended up being kind of the most important, I guess arguably the most well-known and important intersection in the city, which is at Broadway and Wall Street. And I would be hard pressed to find another place anywhere in the world that resonates so much with power and money, right? And privilege. It's Broadway and Wall Street. It was at the top of a hill and still is at the top of a hill. If you go to the intersection now and you look down Wall Street, you're looking downhill. So it had views of the river, and that's, I think, why they put the church there. It was at the northern end of the colony at that point. And it was a very simple stone church that they built with the steeple facing the river, front door facing the river, the back was to Broadway. And it's important for a lot of reasons. Trinity Church ended up being the wealthiest congregation in the entire country because they owned a lot of land and still own a lot of land in Lower Manhattan. And the congregation is still there. It's not the same church, but we'll talk about that later. And so that's important. It was Trinity Church. This was a seat of power and still is. The other thing is that it was built by enslaved Africans, partially. There are records that Trinity Church kept that say very clearly that the enslaved Africans, most of them from Congo originally, dug the foundation, did the heavy lifting in terms of the stones that had to be set. And then there were other people who also worked on it too, indentured servants and also carpenters and craftsmen and things like that. But a lot of the labor came from enslaved people. And then the other interesting thing about it is that William Kidd worked on the project, the famous Captain Kidd. He lived on Wall Street at the time. And there are records of him loaning equipment and things like that. So it was completed in 1698. And this was kind of the first really significant public building in the city. So here, this is where they built it, at the top of this hill. And it was right where this section of the wall is. And so at that point, the wall was a ruin. And so they cleared the rubble of the wall away in order to build the church. So it's on Broadway here, Broadway, and this is Wall Street, this is Broadway. And then it's just north of this area, which is the cattle market. So we're kind of skipping through the 18th century here, early 18th century a little bit. But the cattle market, which was an open place, but certainly not a park. It was taken over by three really wealthy merchants, business people of high standing in the community, Bayard, Chambers, and Jay. Peter Jay was, I think, the father or grandfather of John Jay, who was one of the founding fathers. The Bayards were a Dutch family. And they convinced the city council, which at that time was called the Common Council, to basically give them, for a really nominal fee, use of the cattle market as not a public park, but a private park for the use of their friends and them. And they put a fence around it. And this was significant, as you'll see in the second part of this lecture. This resonated in the American Revolution, as it turned out. The idea that this was a private park, it had been a public space, but it's enclosed by a few wealthy private residents for their own use. And they used it for a game called Nine Pins, which was a version of bowling. And so it became known as Bowling Green. And it became the centerpiece of the wealthiest community in the city. So Bayard, Chambers, and Jay built mansions on Broadway facing the Bowling Green. And so it went from being a really strange, kind of nasty, open, smelly space used for selling livestock to this really beautiful park with a fence around it. So this is how it looked much later, almost 100 years later, 1820s. And then still later, now I'm digressing, I'm just showing you what it became. This is in 1918, and this is in the 1920s. And this is what it looks like today. It's still there. It's a tiny little park with a fountain in the middle. Okay, so now we're skipping ahead even further to the 1760s. And I want to show you, these are two plans from the reading. The first is the Montresor plan. John Montresor was a cartographer in the British Army. So 1766, so this is 10 years before the American Revolution. And this is an incredibly beautifully drawn and very accurate map of the city that shows not only the tip of the island, but also the outlying areas, the farmland and some of the highways and swamps and things like that. So, so what we've been looking at in the Costello plan was just the part of the city down here. So here's Wall Street right there. There's Trinity Church. So New Amsterdam was really like, the urban part of it was really tiny. It was just like that in the 1660s. And then, so 100 years later, 1760s, you can see how much the city has grown. So the wall's not there anymore. The city has grown on both sides of Broadway, all the way up to the Commons, which was originally a rectangle. By this point, it's been whittled down to a triangle. So keep your eyes on the Commons because we can see what that becomes later. The Commons was like a communal pasture land, a place to put your sheep and cows. So the city is now almost surrounded the Commons. And the city has grown so much by this point that Trinity Church decides to build a second church north of Trinity, almost to the Commons, which is right here, which is St. Paul's Chapel. So both of them are on Broadway. St. Paul's is here and Trinity is here. And then you can see that Broadway continues past the Common, but then it dead ends. And why does it dead end? It dead ends because there's this huge swamp here. So this is a salt marsh that is the discharge area for a freshwater spring right here called the Collect Pond. And then if you wanted to leave town, your best chances were to take this street here, which swerves around the Collect Pond, which is called, at this point, it's called Bowery Lane. Today it's called just the Bowery, and it's still there today. And that would connect to highways north of town. You could also leave town by this route, which is Greenwich Street, or Greenwich Avenue, I guess, which is still there today. But you can see, if you can see the laser pointer here, it had to cross over the swamp. So it was often flooded. So the best way out of town was the Bowery. And Broadway just was not extended across the swamp, which I'll show you in a second, until 1776. So this is 10 years before that happened. So St. Paul's Chapel, built the same year as the map was drawn, 1766, is still there today. It's the oldest public building in Manhattan, nearly destroyed on September 11th, and also nearly destroyed 10 years after it was built in the Great Fire, which I talk about in the second part of the lecture. So it's a beautiful building in the Georgian style, which we'll talk about once we talk about housing. But you know, the Georgian style is like a neoclassical style, very symmetrical, has brownstone columns there. And if I remember right, I think the building material is either schist or granite. I can't remember. And it's got this beautiful spire that was added a little bit later. I think added maybe 10 years later. So that's still there today on Broadway. And then, so to look at the whole map, north of town, you can see that here's the Bowery. It connects to other highways. These would have just been, you know, dirt paths, basically, dirt roads. And then this patchwork that you see here, all these little pink squares, that's all farmland. And then this part, if you can see it, here, it's really faint, but you can see that they've already laid out more streets to develop, like a gridiron of streets in this area. So the city is developing. It's not pushing up Broadway because at this point there's no way to get across the swamp. It's following the Bowery. So initially the Bowery was kind of the road that spread the urban fabric into the farmland north of town. So here's some important high points of the Montresor plan. Some of them I've already pointed out. Here's the commons here, the collect pond here, and then here's the Bowery. And you can see there's topography here. So there's not mountains, but there's hills. This is called Bayard's Mount right here. And there's another hill over here. You can see here's a windmill right here on the Bayard property. And then this is the Greenwich Road over here. And this big salt marsh here is called Lispenard's Meadows. So it was a salt marsh. So here's the Hudson River, which is salt water at this point. It's fresh water further to the north. The fresh water is coming out of the collect pond and then moving kind of in a slow sheet of water with rushes, you know, it's a wetland towards this discharge area and then into the river, and then it's subjected to the tides. So then when the tides turn, the water would backwash into the swamp. So that's why it's a salt marsh. So this water would have been a combination of salt water and fresh water. And you can see the same ecosystem if you drive along the coast of Connecticut. There's a lot of this same kind of terrain. And you can imagine that it would have been a habitat for wading birds, fish, songbirds, lots and lots of different kinds of insects. And it was kind of amazing as a way of preventing floods because it just kind of naturally kept its own level. It's accepting water from the collect pond, flushing it out through the river, and then it kind of comes back. And so it's always cleansing itself. The Dutch hated it and the English hated it. They wanted this to go away. They wanted Lispenard's Meadows to go away in the worst way. First of all, the Dutch loved building canals. So they tried to build canals through the swamp and that didn't work. There's just too much water. And then the English, and then after the revolution, it became an American city. The Americans then took up this project and they're gonna get rid of Lispenard's Meadows once and for all. So early 19th century, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, they start just dumping dirt into dumping dirt, until it gradually gets covered over. They dump dirt into the collect pond, which ended up being really deep. So it took years and years for them to fill it up. They eventually fill up the collect pond, fill up the swamp, Lispenard's Meadows. They cut a canal through the middle of it. They build a street next to the canal, which was called Canal Street, which is still there. Sorry, a road over the what had been the canal. The canal didn't work. And so it was just a disaster because the water, of course, was still there. The collect pond had been covered over, but you know, water will find a way out. And so then they had catastrophic floods and they were building streets and building neighborhoods and buildings, and the basements were filling up with water for generations. And it's still at sea level. So during Hurricane Sandy a few years ago, of course, Canal Street flooded. So ecologically speaking, they should have just left it alone. It would have been fine the way it was. So this is just kind of like a detail. There's the windmill. Here's the collect pond. Here's the meadows. You can see at this point, they're already trying to cut canals through it. And this is a lovely little sketch of Lisbonard's Meadows taken from Broadway, looking west toward the river. You can see there's a sailboat here. And this is in the winter when the meadows would freeze over, and these are children ice skating on the meadows. And this is a view of Bayard's Mount, looking toward the collect pond, which is right here, and then back toward the city. So these are the buildings of King's College, which later became Columbia when it was down there. I believe this is St. Paul's, I believe, and this is Trinity way over here, I think. So you can kind of see that there was definitely some topography, and Bayard's Mount was eventually shaved down and pushed into the collect pond to help fill it. So the same year as the Montresor plan, the other map that's in your reading is the Ratzer map. And this shows a lot of the same information as the Montresor map, at least in Manhattan. Also incredibly detailed. But what is really important about this map is that it shows Brooklyn in a lot of detail. So this is Brooklyn over here across the river. You can see the salt marshes here that are today's Red Hook neighborhood. You can see where the ferry came in. You can see this road here, which is the road to Flatbush when Flatbush was a village, which was down here somewhere, I think. And everything else was farmland. So this is it's difficult to see at this scale. When the pandemic is over, the Brooklyn Historical Society, a couple of years ago, discovered a copy of this map. There's very few copies of these maps. And they put it on the wall. So you can go to the Brooklyn Historical Society and see it, and it's huge, and you can see all the detail that doesn't really show up in slides or in books. Very detailed map. And then this is the companion map, which is called the Ratzer plan or the Ratzen plan. I think it's just a misspelling, but in the reading they explain the discrepancy. Does anybody remember why one is called the Ratzer and one is called the Ratzen?
It's just a misspelling.
Yeah.
Misspelling, yeah.
Yeah, they just misspelled his name.
So this is a detail of the other map showing Manhattan. And so what I'd like you to do is just, since they were the same year, you should compare the Montresor plan and the Ratzer plan and just see if anything's different, and just compare them. I think that would be interesting for you to do. So here's the fort, here's Trinity, here's St. Paul's, which was brand new. Here's the Commons, here's Broadway as a dead end. Here's the collect pond, here's the Lisbonard's Meadows. Here's the Bowery going out of town. What this map shows in more detail compared to the Montresor plan is that you can definitely see that the city is expanding along the Bowery. All these new streets have been laid out. And there's even a public space that's being built here called the Great Square. I don't think that was ever actually built, but there was an idea of it. At least it was on the maps. And so this shows more clearly that the city, just kind of step by step, street by street, building by building, is gradually heading into the north, into the farmland. And that's a process that will continue through the early 20th century. Early 20th century, Upper Manhattan still had some farms, like Inwood. Washington Heights was still kind of suburban. And the last farm in Manhattan was owned by an Italian-American family, immigrants, not owned by, but they rented it and operated it as a farm into the early 1950s. And that was up in Inwood in the farthest tip of the island. So that was the last farm on Manhattan. So this is a really, really gradual process. of the city gradually taking over from farmland. So this is the Montresor plan again. If you want to just go back and forth in the reading and just see, the reproductions in the reading are okay, but I found that if you just Google the name of the map, you'll often get much more crisp, high-res copies just on the internet that you can look at. So I said I was going to finish at 1 and I finished at 12:59. So that's my accomplishment for the day. So lecture 2, I will post as soon as we finish here, and you can watch that like right away or tomorrow or the next day. Does anybody have any questions about this lecture or the last couple lectures?
Are you gonna upload the recording for this lecture?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, thank you.
So you guys are always going to have recordings of all the lectures. The other thing I would like to do is I'm meeting with group 1 today and then group 2. I would like to record at least one of those and post those so you can kind of see what we talked about. Yep. Any other questions?
Do we email you for attendance?
Do you what?
Do we have to email you for attendance? Like,
No, the attendance is kept on Zoom automatically.
okay.
It's the most
Okay.
wonderful thing. It generates a report that tells me not only who was here, but who was here and for how long. So if you're only here for 5 minutes, it will say you're only here for 5 minutes. So it's great. So that's how I'm gonna take attendance.
Do you think since like the Dutch originally like occupied the southern tip of Manhattan, that was obviously out in the open and not able to be well fortified. Do you think that it would have been more advantageous, like if they could have gotten to like upper Manhattan, that would have been a more like advantageous spot for them to fortify their defenses?
Yeah, you're right. You're totally right. They could have built a fort up in Washington Heights and they could have defended themselves from the river. They would have been above the river. They could have shelled any ships that tried to bother them. That would have been a much better idea. Why they didn't do that, I don't know. But New Amsterdam was on its last legs at that point. The company was bankrupt. There were only 1,500 people left, and I think it was kind of a done deal. And I actually think that the business leaders in the Dutch community were happy to see the British because they brought money and connections and a lot more slaves from Africa. And after that, the colony really started to grow. So I don't think the Dutch were upset about it. I think Stuyvesant was upset about it, but he was more like an Army Navy guy. But the business people, I think, were thrilled that the English were there.
I have a question. Or June, go ahead, June.
All right, I was just wondering how large the presence of slaves were during this time.
So the Dutch, they had a presence under the Dutch. But I think I might have mentioned in the first lecture, they had a lot more so-called freedoms. They could own their own land. So a lot of them had farms north of town. They didn't have to live with the person who owned them, enslaved them. And, they could gather in groups and things like that. The percentage of the population under the Dutch, I don't remember, but I know that the population grew drastically once the English took over. And shortly after, within a generation of the British taking over, a quarter of the city's population were enslaved Africans. A quarter.
Wow.
So with that big of a population, the British were afraid of a revolt, and there were several revolts that happened. There was one in 1741 that was very coordinated, where the enslaved people were going to take over, and they put that down. They put the leaders of that rebellion to death in a very public and gruesome way, and they really made sure that the enslaved people couldn't gather, couldn't talk to each other, couldn't read, the same thing that's happened later in American slavery, not allowed to read, not allowed to gather, certainly not allowed to live apart or own their own property.
Thank you.
I mean, I think it's important for us to realize that that was there from the very beginning. That tragic system was there from the very beginning. It was one of the foundations for settling the New World. Any other questions?
I have a question about, so during New Amsterdam, as you can see on the Castello plan, the farms that people had were quite large, so I'm assuming they were more for like self-sustenance and sale or trade or export. So was there any like regular trade or communication with the villages and other parts of the island for products, for just as forms of trade?
Yeah, these were, this was local produce that was being grown. I don't think they were really shipping stuff to other cities. That happened later when upstate cities would ship stuff down to the city. It wasn't on an industrial scale at this point. It was, a lot of the farms were pretty big, but they weren't producing food to like ship down to North Carolina or something. And certainly, yeah, the island was eating the food that was produced. There were wheat farms, corn farms. Some of them were as small as kind of like a large garden. Some of the wealthier people had hundreds of acres. And people in the villages lived off of that, and the city as well. And that, must have been really nice to always eat local produce. That must have been great. The city was really pretty dirty at that point and unsanitary, but that part of it would have been really great. It's a healthy way to eat locally, right? That was a good question.
I have a, I guess, a bit of a comment, or not so much of a question, but I've read somewhere where Wall Street, the original intention was not simply to protect from a British invasion, but it was actually to keep the Lenape and the other natives out of the settlement itself. Is that something that is accurate?
The thing I've always heard is that it was built to keep out the British, that was the threat they were really worried about. By the time he built it, the Lenape weren't really a threat anymore. And they knew how to get into settlement anyway. I have read accounts of them, even after the wall was there, the Lenape were still walking in and out whenever they wanted to, sometimes right through the wall. So I don't think it was so much about the Lenape, but it might have been partially about that.
Because if you think about it, based on the Castello plan, it did call out that, for example, the slaves were housed. Basically, they were housed on the Upper East Side along the coast, so that would be outside of the settlement itself. So anything with outside of the settlement technically would be wildland per se, according to maybe to the British, and not to the British, to the Dutch.
Yeah, I've never understood that map. The Manatus map has that marked as like one place where they lived, because other things I've read that wasn't true. They had farms everywhere. The Africans had farms everywhere. So they weren't confined to, maybe when that map was drawn, that was in the 1630s, maybe they still were confined to that one part of the island, but after that, 1640s, 1650s, they weren't. So I don't quite understand that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Real quick,
Yeah.
I was wondering if you thought that like there's like a little stone in Inwood Hill Park that says like there used to be a tree here that the Lenape like sold the island or rented the island, bartered the island. Obviously they didn't actually like have that conception of selling land. But do you think that actually happened, or was that apocryphal?
There was a tree there. It was a really famous old tree that was beloved for generations, you know, and that story gradually evolved that that was the tree where they sold the island. But it just sounds too good to be true. I think that was a myth. It was a really old, beautiful tree that somehow that story got attached to it. It's very unlikely that that was actually where it happened. But, you know, like any urban myth, who knows? It's possible. Some urban myths end up being true. Like the thing with alligators in the sewers, you know that? You've all heard that, right? This urban myth that there's alligators in New York sewers. That's totally based in fact. A friend of mine did research and he found, I think it was in the 1930s, there was an alligator in the sewers that was captured. So that was the origin of that myth. So sometimes it's true or partially true.
Do you
That
think
one,
there's still
that one I
alligators?
don't buy. Say what?
Do you think there's still alligators in the sewers?
Let's go see. There's only one way to find out.
I don't want to believe that.
You have better chances of finding turtles.
Turtles, yeah. If I go down there, I want to find an alligator. I want it to be worth my time. I want there to be alligators down there somewhere. That would be great. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, if there were in the 30s, there probably are now. Why not? Okay, I think we'll end there. So I'm going to end the meeting. Those of you in group 1, come back at 1:30, same link. And then group 2 at 2 o'clock, same link. Everybody got the group assignments?
Could you email me my thing? I couldn't find it.
Yeah, sure. Let's see, I might just have it right here. I can show it to you.
Wait, I'm sorry. Were we supposed to do something for the group? So that's just like a group meeting, and we're just gonna discuss.
Yeah, just discuss. I might give you a little informal quiz or something. I don't know. I haven't done it before. Here's the groups. Can you all see that?
Professor, today you are meeting only with group 1 and group 2?
Yep, group 1 at 1:30, group 2 at 2 o'clock.
Okay.
And then here's the other groups. And if anybody else didn't get this, so Wyatt, you are in group 4. So I will meet you with you in 2 weeks because we don't have class next week.
For the assignments, will you be emailing them once the week comes?
Which assignment?
Is there like a group assignment, or are we just gonna have?
No. This is just a chance for you to ask questions and.
Okay. Thank you.
Just to talk in a smaller setting, that's all.
Thank you.
No assignments, no projects, pretty informal. I just want to see what questions you have and make sure you're getting what you need to get out of the material. So you should just bring questions or anything that's not clear from the lectures or the readings, you can bring it up. So no class next week, but I'm going to send you the next reading. I will also post the reading, and it also comes with a map that I want you to explore. A really cool map. And then I want you to just kind of look at it in detail and get a sense of it, because it will help with the next couple of lectures. And then the reading report is due on the 19th, but if you can get it in sooner, that would be great, because I can start grading it. Okay, one last time. Any questions before we end?
Yeah, I have a question about the reading report. Is it okay if we include content that we covered in the lecture that wasn't covered in the reading? So like, for example, like the glacier information that was in the first lecture?
Yeah, I would be thrilled if you did. I mean, I want you to make connections between the reading and the lectures. So any connections you can make, I would be thrilled to see that, you know. Why are we doing the reports? I just want to see that you're getting stuff out of the reading. And since the readings and the lectures really are connected, it would be hard to do a reading report without bringing in something from the lectures. So sorry, I just realized you guys have been chatting and I haven't looked at that, sorry. Oh, I guess you asked most of these. Sorry, I didn't see them. Oh, Abram, you asked, how did the British justify slavery if it was illegal in the Isles, meaning the British Isles?
Yeah.
I wasn't aware that it was illegal in the British Isles at that point, was it?
To be honest, I'm not totally sure. I might be making that up.
Well, you're not making it up. It might have
only be illegal if they couldn't collect tax on it, just like anything else in in all of our governments.
I thought it was a little bit later that it was outlawed in Britain, and but I mean, it happened in stages. They would like outlaw the slave trade, and I know that it was illegal in Great Britain, but was still legal in the colonies for quite a while afterwards. So it happened stage by stage, and yes, the Dutch did allow slavery. They depended on it. Kadisha asked, can you post the, oh yeah, I answer that. Yes, this will be posted as well. All the lectures will be recorded and posted. Okay, guys. So group 1, I will see you at 1:30. Group 2 at 2 o'clock. If anybody else has any other questions, please email me and I will try to get back to you. Okay, thanks guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.